My name is Grace Moretti. I am 32 years old and serving as a cyber logistics officer in the United States Air Force taught me exactly how to identify a threat vector. But nothing prepared me for the ambush waiting inside my own living room. 72 hours ago, I was gripping the steering wheel of my heavy SUV as it careened down a steep, rain-slicked Kansas highway. I pressed my boot against the brake pedal. It went straight to the floorboards. There was no resistance. There was no pressure. Just the chilling realization that someone had severed the hydraulic lines. As the vehicle picked up speed toward a crowded intersection, my phone rang through the dashboard speakers. It was my husband, Trenton. He was calling to gloat. He expected to hear the chaotic aftermath of a fatal wreck. Instead, I answered with a steady voice. He tried to hide his panic by sneering that I was late for work and that I was fired. He thought he had stripped me of my home, my 1-year-old son, and my life savings. He demanded to know where I was hiding. I told him I was at my new job. He screamed into the receiver that I had nothing left to fight with. I smiled, keeping my eyes locked on the approaching steel guardrail, and told him I already did it. Then he heard a heavy, authoritative knock on his office door over the phone line. What walked through that door wiped the arrogant smirk off his face, evicted his elitist mother from her sprawling Wichita mansion, and dismantled a multi-million-dollar aviation empire piece by piece. My husband thought a dead woman could not testify in family court. He was wrong. I spent the last 9 months neutralizing digital threats in a windowless bunker overseas. I track anomalies in code. I secure perimeters. I build defenses that foreign entities cannot penetrate. Yet the most lethal danger to my existence was not a foreign adversary. It was the man I married. It was the family I married into. People who viewed loyalty as a transaction and genetics as a currency. They believed my Midwestern roots made me weak. They assumed my quiet demeanor meant I was an easy target. They assumed I would fold under the pressure of public humiliation and financial starvation. They failed to realize that when you back a military operative into a corner, you do not get a victim. You get a strategist. Before I explain how a fabricated DNA test turned my homecoming into a federal crime scene, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to Samantha Told Stories. I would love to know your age and what state you are listening from in the comments below. The Kansas sky stretched out for miles above me, a bruised canopy of twilight hanging over endless acres of pale, whispering wheat. I guided my truck down the long gravel driveway of our ranch. The tires crunched a familiar grounding rhythm against the crushed stone. 9 months. I had been away from this land for 9 months. All I wanted was the quiet isolation of the Great Plains and the warmth of my own home. I cut the engine. In the passenger seat, my 1-year-old son Leo slept peacefully. His small chest rose and fell in a steady cadence. I unbuckled him, resting his warm weight against my shoulder. I grabbed my olive-drab duffel bag and walked up the wide wooden steps to the front porch. I expected the porch light to flick on. I expected the front door to swing open. I expected my husband to meet me at the threshold with a smile. Instead, the house stood dark and silent. I pushed my key into the lock. The brass tumblers clicked. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the tiled foyer. The air inside felt stagnant. It hung heavy with a staged, suffocating tension. Trenton Caldwell stood by the stone fireplace. At 35, my husband was a rising executive in Wichita aviation manufacturing sector. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit. A single vein pulsed rhythmically at his temple. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid. He did not step forward to greet me. He did not reach out to hold his son. He simply stared at me with eyes devoid of any familiar warmth. Sitting on the edge of the leather sofa was his mother, Patricia Caldwell. She wore her signature pearls and a pristine cashmere cardigan. Her spine was unnaturally straight, radiating an air of untouchable elitism. The Caldwells built their legacy in Kansas aviation, and Patricia treated anyone outside their tax bracket as a localized infection. Trenton, I asked, keeping my voice low so as not to wake Leo, "What is going on?" Trenton reached into his suit jacket. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He took 2 measured steps forward and dropped it onto the glass coffee table. The paper landed with a soft, dismissive thud. "He is not mine," Grace Trenton said. His voice lacked any tremor of heartbreak. It was a cold, rehearsed line, delivered for an audience of one. "I know what you did during your deployment," he added. The accusation hovered in the quiet foyer. For a fraction of a second, my brain refused to process the syllables. I blinked, looking from Trenton to the folded paper. Patricia stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored slacks. She looked at me, her lips curling into a sneer of profound disgust. "I knew it the moment Trenton brought you home," she said, her tone dripping with venom. "You dragged the stench of the barracks into my son's house. Even now, wearing that uniform, you smell like cheap motel soap. You are a disgrace to this family." The civilian mother inside me felt a primal urge to scream. I wanted to demand an explanation. I wanted to defend my honor. But the Air Force officer took immediate command. Years of hostile environment training rewired my nervous system in a microsecond. Panic is a luxury. Assessment is survival. I locked my emotions behind a reinforced mental wall. I shifted Leo higher on my shoulder, shielding his head, and stepped closer to the coffee table. I looked down at the document. The bold heading read, "Certified Paternity Results." Trenton expected me to shatter. He anticipated tears, frantic apologies, or hysterical denials. He wanted a messy, emotional breakdown that he could leverage. But I read data anomalies for a living. It took my trained eyes less than 3 seconds to dismantle his illusion. The header font was standard Arial. Accredited medical laboratories mandated Times New Roman for official diagnostic records. The margins were misaligned, a hallmark of a cheap internet template. Most glaringly, the specimen barcode at the bottom of the page lacked the mandatory 12-digit alphanumeric sequencing required by state health departments. It was a forgery. A desperate amateur forgery. I raised my eyes, meeting Trenton's gaze. I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his polished features. He realized I was not breaking. He realized I was calculating. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted movement in the hallway. Ashley, his 26-year-old assistant, hovered near the staircase. She avoided my gaze, staring intensely at a stack of luggage sitting by the door. My luggage. They had already packed my bags. "Trent," I said, my voice steady, carrying a lethal, icy edge. "If you are going to fabricate a medical document, you should at least pay for a better graphic designer." I opened my mouth to pull the thread on his entire charade, but a sharp, authoritative pounding on the front door interrupted me. Trenton, uncertainty vanished, replaced by a smug, victorious smirk. He adjusted his silk tie and nodded toward the entryway. The heavy oak door swung open. 2 local Kansas police officers stepped into the foyer, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Right behind them stood a woman in a gray blazer, a state-issued clipboard clutched to her chest. The ambush was not just biological, it was institutional. The officers stepped past the threshold, their boots tracking muddy Kansas rainwater onto the pristine hard wood. Their posture was tense, their hands hovered near their utility belts. Behind them, the woman in the gray blazer clutched a thick manila folder, her eyes darting between me and the child resting on my shoulder. Trenton immediately shifted his demeanor. The cold, calculating executive vanished. In his place stood a trembling, exhausted father. He let his shoulders slump. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it just enough to convey deep desperation. Officers, thank goodness you are here, Trenton said, his voice cracking with a manufactured vulnerability that made my stomach turn. I did not know what else to do. She just walked in. The lead officer stepped forward, a stern man with graying temples. Ma'am, I need you to remain calm. We received an emergency call regarding a domestic disturbance and a potential threat to a minor. I am perfectly calm, officer, I replied. My tone was even devoid of the frantic pitch they clearly expected. This is my home. I just returned from a 9-month deployment. My husband is attempting to orchestrate an illegal eviction using a fabricated DNA document. Trenton shook his head, retreating a few steps, as if he feared I might strike him. That is not the only document I submitted to the court, he said, turning to the woman in the blazer. Tell her what the judge signed an hour ago. The woman stepped forward. She cleared her throat, avoiding direct eye contact. I am an agent with Child Protective Services, she stated. We have an emergency ex parte order for the immediate removal of the minor child. She held out the manila folder. I did not reach for it. I kept both arms wrapped securely around Leo. On what grounds, I asked, a judge does not grant an emergency removal over a disputed paternity test? Trenton reached into his briefcase resting on the armchair. He pulled out a second stack of papers, handing them directly to the lead officer. These are her official military medical files, he said, his voice dripping with rehearsed sorrow. I gained access through my spousal emergency portal. She suffered a severe psychological break during her deployment. The base psychiatrist diagnosed her with violent paranoid delusions. She refused treatment and demanded a discharge. I have been living in terror, waiting for her to come back and snap. I stared at the papers in the officer's hand. Even from a few feet away, I could see the official seal of the Department of Defense printed at the top of the page. The sheer audacity of his lie sent a shock of ice through my veins. Trenton had not just forged a civilian lab result. He had counterfeited federal intelligence documents. He had submitted them to a state judge under the penalty of perjury. Those records are forged, I said, keeping my gaze locked on the officer. I am an active duty cyber logistics officer. I hold a high-level security clearance. A diagnosis of that nature would trigger an automatic suspension of my credentials. I can provide you with my commanding officer direct contact information right now to verify my operational status. Patricia scoffed from the sofa, clutching her cashmere cardigan. She is delusional, officer. She threatened us the moment she walked through the door. Please, you have to protect my grandson. The lead officer looked at the papers, then back to me. Ma'am, he said, his tone firm and uncompromising. I do not have the authority to authenticate federal documents in this foyer. I have a lawful order signed by a sitting magistrate. The paperwork claims you are a direct threat to the child. You need to hand the boy over to the state agent immediately. If you resist, we will have to use force. The air in the room grew thin. The threat of physical restraint hung heavily between us. Every primal instinct in my body screamed at me to fight. My muscles coiled, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted to draw upon years of close-quarters combat training to clear the room and carry my son out the front door. But the tactical side of my brain overrode the maternal panic. If I fought the police, if I raised my voice, if I caused a scene, I would give them exactly what they needed. I would be playing directly into the unstable narrative Trenton had meticulously constructed for the judge. A physical altercation would provide the permanent proof required to strip my custody rights forever. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I locked my emotions away in a dark, impenetrable vault. I looked down at Leo. His small hands were curled against my collarbone. I pressed my lips to his warm forehead, breathing in the scent of his baby shampoo. I promised him silently that I would tear down the sky to get him back. I stepped toward the state agent. I bypassed Trenton entirely, refusing to acknowledge his existence. I gently lowered my son into the agent-waiting arms. Leo stirred, letting out a soft, confused whimper at the sudden transfer. Hearing that tiny sound felt like a physical blow to my chest, but I did not let my hands tremble. The lead officer nodded, relaxing his stance just a fraction. "Thank you for cooperating, ma'am. You will need to vacate the premises tonight. You can contest the order in family court on Friday." I turned away from the officers. I memorized the silver numbers etched into their badges. Officer 4092, Officer 7115. Every detail was catalogued for the impending war. As I picked up my duffel bag, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Trenton stood near the hallway, unable to mask his triumph any longer. He raised his left arm, pulling back his tailored sleeve to check the time. Resting on his wrist was an ostentatious vintage aviation watch. It was a heavy piece of polished gold and distressed leather, a rare collector item that cost more than a luxury vehicle. My mind flagged the visual anomaly. Trenton was a successful executive, but he had complained about tight profit margins for months. That watch did not align with a man concerned about a budget. I walked out the front door into the freezing Kansas rain. The porch light remained off. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove away from the ranch I had paid for. The neon sign buzzed with an erratic, irritating hum, casting alternating flashes of red and blue light across the cracked pavement. I parked my truck near the back of the lot, far away from the glowing office window. The small room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. The floral bedspread was thin and worn, the carpet stained with years of neglect. It was a far cry from the pristine comforts of my custom-built home, but it offered the one thing I required right now: total isolation. I dropped my heavy duffel bag onto the floor. The canvas hit the thin carpet with a dull thud. I pulled out my tactical laptop, the matte metal casing cold against my palms. I sat at the scratched wooden desk, ignoring the icy draft seeping through the poorly sealed window frame. I initiated the multi-factor authentication sequence, bypassing the unsecured local motel network to establish a private, encrypted tunnel. Trenton thought his ambush had left me paralyzed. He assumed I would spend the night crying into a cheap pillow, overwhelmed by the loss of my child, waiting for a slow-moving civilian lawyer to return my calls in the morning. He severely underestimated the processing speed of a military operative. I needed to hire a ruthless defense attorney immediately. I needed to secure a legal shark who possessed the clearance to dismantle a forged Department of Defense document before the Friday morning custody hearing. I opened my banking application. I intended to wire a heavy retainer fee from our primary joint savings account. That specific account held my accumulated deployment hazard pay, my specialized clearance bonuses, and the savings I had meticulously built over 5 years of active duty service. The screen loaded the digital interface, glowing stark white against the dark room. I stared at the monitor, my fingers hovering frozen over the keyboard. The balance was 0. I clicked the refresh icon, assuming the rural internet connection had caused a routing error. The page reloaded instantly. The number remained unchanged. $0, 0 cents. My heart rate remained steady, but a cold, sharp focus narrowed my vision. I navigated to the detailed transaction history. Exactly 48 hours ago, while I was 30,000 feet in the air flying back to the States, a massive wire transfer had been initiated. The entire sum had been routed out of the domestic account. I checked my secondary checking account. Empty. I checked my personal credit lines, which Trenton had legal access to as my spouse. They were maxed out, frozen by the bank due to suspicious activity. Every single financial resource tied to my name had been systematically drained into the ether. The cold reality of his strategy settled into my bones. Trenton was not just trying to evict me or win a simple family court dispute. He was executing a textbook financial starvation tactic. He wanted me penniless, desperate, and incapable of mounting a competent legal defense. He intended to leave me stranded in this cheap motel, watching my life unravel without a single dollar to fight back. He wanted to break my spirit before the war even started. I slowly closed the laptop lid. The room fell into deep shadows, lit only by the flickering neon sign outside the window. My husband had taken my home, stolen my son, and drained my life savings. He truly believed he had orchestrated the perfect crime, but he made one fatal miscalculation. He took my money, but he left my training entirely intact. The harsh glare of the laptop screen illuminated the peeling wallpaper of the motel room. The zeros staring back at me were not a glitch. Trenton had executed a flawless financial extraction. I bypassed the commercial banking interface and accessed the county property registry through a secure back door. My fingers flew across the keyboard, hunting for the anomaly. I found it, buried under the real estate liens. Trenton had taken out a secondary mortgage on our Kansas ranch. $600,000 in equity liquidated just 2 weeks ago while I was stationed overseas. How? The bank required dual signatures for any structural asset leverage. I opened the loan origination file. A scanned document materialized on my screen. It was a general power of attorney, granting my husband unilateral control over my financial assets. My signature sat at the bottom, perfectly replicated next to a counterfeit notary stamp. He had forged my name to leverage the home I purchased, turning our property into his personal banking reservoir. A civilian might have called the police or collapsed in defeat. I closed the browser window. I stood up from the rickety desk and walked over to my olive-drab go bag resting on the stained carpet. In my line of work, you never enter a theater of operation without an extraction plan. I reached into the side compartment, pulled out my tactical knife, and sliced a small incision along the reinforced nylon bottom seam. I slid 2 fingers into the hidden lining and extracted a slim black prepaid debit card. It held $10,000 in untraceable emergency funds, a precaution I established years ago for high-risk deployments. Trenton thought he had severed my supply lines. He merely forced me to operate off the grid. I needed legal artillery. A civilian attorney would take weeks to navigate the bureaucracy of a forged federal document and a contested custody battle. I required someone who could act with military precision. I picked up my encrypted mobile device and dialed a secure routing number. The line hissed with static before connecting to Captain Elias Thorne. Thorne was a formidable Judge Advocate General officer stationed at my base. He possessed a razor-sharp legal mind and a reputation for dismantling complex military court-martials. I briefed him on the forged psychiatric evaluation and the emergency custody order. I expected immediate outrage. Instead, I heard a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Captain I prompted, keeping my voice level. "Are you initiating the countermeasure?" Thorne exhaled slowly. "Grace, this involves state family court and civilian property disputes. The military cannot simply kick down the doors of a prominent aviation executive without ironclad jurisdiction. The Caldwell family has significant lobbying influence in Washington. If we move prematurely and fail, the blowback will end both of our careers." The hesitation in his voice triggered a sharp warning in my mind. The Caldwell Aviation Manufacturing Firm held lucrative defense contracts. They employed high-powered lobbyists who routinely rubbed elbows with military brass. For a chilling second, I wondered if Trenton had already anticipated my move. I wondered if he had utilized his corporate connections to pressure the JAG office into standing down. The red tape Thorne mentioned sounded suspiciously like a political roadblock. "Elias," I said, dropping the formal rank. "My husband submitted counterfeit Department of Defense documents to a sitting magistrate. He weaponized a fake psychiatric evaluation bearing a forged federal seal to kidnap a dependent minor. That is espionage under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If you tell me to wait, I will escalate this to the Inspector General and bypass your office entirely." The tension hummed over the encrypted connection. Then Thorne let out a short, cynical laugh. "I just needed to hear that you were ready to burn the ships, Grace. Give me 10 minutes to secure a shadow server. We are initiating a full forensic audit." The shadow audit commenced. While I sat in the freezing motel room, Thorne and his team infiltrated the corporate financial registries tied to the Caldwell aviation empire. I monitored the data packets flowing onto my screen. We were not looking at personal checking accounts anymore. We were dissecting a corporate behemoth. Within 2 hours, the facade of Trenton Perfect executive life shattered. Thorne transmitted a classified ledger directly to my terminal. "Look at the quarterly losses," Thorne instructed over the comms. "Trenton firm is bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate." He bypassed his own compliance department and leveraged millions in restricted corporate funds on high-risk private trading margins. The market turned against him. He is currently drowning in a catastrophic deficit. The puzzle pieces locked together with lethal clarity. The forged DNA test, the counterfeit psychiatric hold, the sudden eviction. Trenton did not care about divorcing me. He did not care about sole custody of Leo. This was a desperate, chaotic smokescreen designed to hide his impending corporate ruin. I ran the numbers. The $600,000 he stole from the house equity was barely a Band-Aid. It covered a fraction of his margin debt. He needed a much larger, untraceable cash injection before the Department of Defense auditors arrived next month to review his government contracts. I realized the true target: Leo. Before my grandfather passed away, he established an irrevocable trust fund for my firstborn child. The trust was valued at exactly $600,000. The funds were locked inaccessible to anyone except the designated primary custodial parent in the event of an emergency. Trenton engineered the entire biological ambush to secure emergency custody. The second the judge granted him full guardianship based on my supposed mental instability, he would gain unilateral control over Leo's trust fund. He intended to drain my son's future to pay off his illegal gambling debts. "We need to locate the stolen house equity," I told Thorne. "If we can prove he routed those funds into an illicit account, we can secure a federal freeze on his assets." I initiated a deep dive algorithm, tracing the wire transfer that emptied our accounts. Trenton had attempted to wash the money through a labyrinth of decentralized exchanges, trying to camouflage the digital footprint. But greedy men always leave a trail. The algorithm isolated a specific routing sequence. The $600,000 had bounced from a domestic bank to a crypto tumbler and then immediately routed into a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Thorne pulled the unredacted incorporation documents for the offshore entity from a federal database. He forwarded the file to my screen. "Check the registered agent," Thorne said, his voice dropping into a grim register. I opened the document. The business was an empty shell with zero operational history. I scanned down to the ownership structure. The offshore account was not registered to Trenton Caldwell. It was registered to a name I recognized instantly from the Foyer ambush: Ashley, his 26-year-old assistant. She was not just a bystander or a subordinate caught in the crossfire. She was the managing director of the shell company holding the stolen equity. The betrayal deepened, transforming from a desperate financial crime into a highly coordinated, premeditated conspiracy. My husband and his young assistant were actively plotting to steal my son, drain his trust fund, and vanish. Ashley. Her name pulsed on the glowing monitor, a glaring neon sign pointing to the depth of my husband's betrayal. Trenton was not acting alone in a sudden fit of jealous rage. He had meticulously cultivated a co-conspirator, a subordinate whose ambition matched his own greed. But exposing the offshore shell company was only half the battle. To reclaim my son and destroy the emergency custody order, I needed to obliterate the foundational lie anchoring his entire legal strategy: the fabricated paternity test. Trenton operated under the arrogant assumption that wealth could erase history. Weeks before my deployment, he dispatched his corporate tech team to infiltrate the local civilian fertility clinic database. They executed a localized digital scrub, wiping our patient profiles from the regional servers. He thought he had severed the only tangible link to the truth, leaving the forged DNA document as the sole surviving narrative. He drastically underestimated the reach of an Air Force cyber logistics officer. Civilian networks are fragile, easily manipulated by amateur corporate hackers. Military dependents, however, fall under the umbrella of the Defense Health Agency. Every procedure, every prescription, every consent form processed through our insurance undergoes mandatory federal synchronization. I did not bother fighting through the civilian clinic firewalls. I bypassed them entirely, logging directly into the encrypted military medical archives. My keystrokes echoed in the quiet motel room, a steady drumbeat of impending retribution. Within seconds, the search algorithm bypassed the localized wipe and located the redundant, federally backed up hard copies of our in vitro fertilization records. The pristine, unaltered documents materialized on my screen, bearing the official clinic letterhead and notarized signatures. I stared at the digital files, the reality of his sociopathic manipulation washing over me. He had taken a painful biological truth and twisted it into a weapon of character assassination. The glowing PDF on my monitor transported me back to a sterile clinic exam room 14 months ago. I closed my eyes, letting the memory play out with vivid, agonizing clarity. Trenton sat on the edge of the examination table, his head buried in his hands. The polished, untouchable aviation executive was gone, replaced by a shattered, weeping man. The reproductive endocrinologist had just delivered the catastrophic diagnostic results: azoospermia, irreversible sterility. Trenton had never possessed a single viable sperm cell. He sobbed into his palms, the sound raw and guttural. His devastation was not rooted in the loss of potential fatherhood. It was rooted in sheer, blinding terror. Patricia Caldwell demanded a purebred heir to inherit the aviation dynasty. The Caldwell aviation empire was built on a foundation of pristine public perception, and a barren son did not fit the narrative. She evaluated human worth through genetic pedigree. Trenton knew that if his status-obsessed mother discovered his biological failure, she would view him as a defective asset. To protect his fragile ego, he begged me to keep the diagnosis a secret. He willingly, legally consented to utilizing an anonymous donor. I stared at the digital consent form on my laptop, tracing his signature at the bottom of the page. He authorized the procedure. He claimed legal paternity long before Leo took his first breath. I remembered the way he held my hand in the recovery room, promising we would protect our family at all costs. Every word was a calculated manipulation. He allowed me to endure months of grueling hormone injections, all while planning to use the child as an insurance policy against his own financial incompetence. Then he hid his secret from his mother, weaponized the resulting child to frame me for infidelity, and used her elitist bigotry to fund his legal war. Before I could download the federal documents to my secure hard drive, my encrypted mobile device vibrated against the wooden desk. It was Captain Thorne. His voice carried a grim, urgent cadence that cut through the silence of the motel room. Grace Thorne said, his tone lacking any standard military pleasantries. The situation just escalated beyond civil court. Your husband filed a formal complaint with the Judge Advocate General office 10 minutes ago. He submitted the forged DNA test alongside a sworn affidavit accusing you of engaging in an extramarital affair during your overseas deployment. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. Adultery under the Uniform Code of Military Justice is a severe criminal offense. Thorne emphasized that the military police take adultery charges incredibly seriously when combined with the erratic behavior outlined in the psychiatric forgery. Trenton was not merely trying to steal Leo and secure the trust fund. He was attempting to trigger a court-martial. A conviction would strip my rank, incinerate my top-secret security clearance, and obliterate the pension I had earned over a decade of service. He intended to leave me dishonorably discharged, permanently unemployable, and destitute. He is trying to paralyze me, I told Thorne, my mind analyzing the tactical layout of the battlefield. The civilian custody hearing is scheduled for this Friday. The Department of Defense corporate audit on his aviation firm begins next Monday. He is racing a ticking clock. If he can secure a permanent custody ruling on Friday, he gains immediate access to the $600,000 trust fund. He wires the cash to Ashley offshore account, liquidates the remaining assets, and boards a private flight out of Kansas before the military auditors realize the defense contracts are empty. He filed the UCMJ complaint to ensure I am too busy fighting for my freedom to stop his exit strategy. Thorne agreed, warning me that military investigators would be knocking on my door by dawn. I promised him I would have the defensive perimeter established long before sunrise. I ended the call and turned my attention back to the monitor, preparing to package the IVF consent forms and the offshore ledger into a single lethal prosecution packet. I reached for my coffee cup, my eyes locked on the downloading progress bar. The digital counter reached 99%. A deafening crash shattered the quiet isolation of the motel room. Fragments of jagged glass exploded inward, spraying across the thin carpet and raining down on my keyboard. The freezing Midwestern wind cut through the shattered glass, carrying the scent of damp soil and approaching rain. The draft extinguished the small desk lamp. I dropped to the floor, instantly, muscle memory taking over, my hand flying to the tactical knife strapped to my ankle. I stayed low, scanning the darkness outside, expecting an armed breach. No one entered. The parking lot remained empty, illuminated only by the buzzing neon sign. I crawled toward the shattered glass, my boots crunching over the debris. Resting near the foot of the bed was a fist-sized river rock. Wrapped tightly around the stone with black electrical tape was a crumpled piece of notebook paper. I peeled the tape back, unfolding the note under the pale light of the computer monitor. The message was scrawled in frantic, heavy ink. "Leave Kansas tonight, or you will not survive to see the courtroom. My husband was losing his nerve." The white-collar executive was unraveling, crossing the line from corporate fraud into physical intimidation. I stared at the threatening note, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. He wanted me to run. Instead, I prepared to hunt. The shattered glass scattered across the motel carpet served as a stark reminder of my husband's deteriorating mental state. That crude river rock was a primitive scare tactic. It signaled that Trenton was operating on raw fear. Fear breeds erratic decisions. It forces a target to seek validation and construct defensive perimeters. The very next evening, his need for validation manifested as a desperate display of power. Patricia Caldwell hosted her annual aviation charity gala in the heart of downtown Wichita. The event was held inside a sprawling, opulent ballroom, featuring towering crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Patricia utilized philanthropy to launder her reputation, treating the Kansas elite to vintage champagne while securing her status at the top of the social hierarchy. Tonight, the gala served a much darker purpose. It was a public tribunal designed to assassinate my character. I did not cower in the motel room. I did not hide from the narrative they were spinning. I prepared for battle. I opened my garment bag and retrieved my Air Force service dress uniform. Every silver button shone. The dark fabric lay perfectly pressed. The ribbons adorning my chest represented years of navigating hostile digital environments and securing classified perimeters. Those commendations now served as my armor against domestic predators. I drove my truck to the venue, handing the keys to a bewildered valet. Pushing through the heavy mahogany doors, I stepped into a sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. A string quartet played a soft classical melody in the corner. The room hummed with the quiet, polite chatter of wealthy executives, local politicians, and aerospace investors. Near the center of the room, Patricia held court. She stood elevated on a small carpeted dais, flanked by her wealthy sycophants. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, projecting an aura of tragic grace. Her voice carried across the room, ensuring everyone within earshot heard her rehearsed lament. "It has been a waking nightmare for my son," Patricia murmured to a group of defense contractors. "We welcomed her into this family, but the deployment broke her mind. She came back erratic, unfaithful, violent. Trenton had to beg the courts to step in just to keep my grandson safe. It breaks my heart to see a veteran fall so far, but we must prioritize the child." Her audience offered sympathetic nods, sipping their drinks and shaking their heads at my supposed depravity. They were eager to consume the scandal. I stepped fully into the light of the ballroom. I did not announce myself. I simply walked forward. The heavy, rhythmic click of my polished uniform shoes echoed against the marble floor. A woman holding a crystal flute turned her head. Her jaw went slack. She tapped the shoulder of the man next to her. One by one, the conversations died. The string quartet faltered, a violinist missing a note, as the oppressive tension sucked the oxygen from the room. The sea of wealthy patrons parted before me. They stepped backward in intimidated silence, creating a wide, clear path straight toward the Caldwell matriarch. Patricia lowered her handkerchief. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. Her manicured hands gripped the fabric of her designer gown. She expected a weeping, broken mother hiding in shame. She did not expect a commissioned officer commanding the room with a lethal, icy stare. Before she could signal security, Patricia turned and retreated. She practically scurried toward a set of frosted glass doors leading to a private VIP lounge. She wanted to escape the public spectacle. I followed her, stepping into the secluded room just as the door clicked shut behind us. The VIP lounge smelled of expensive leather and blooming orchids. Patricia backed away, bumping into a mahogany side table. Her chest heaved. "You have no right to be here," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You are trespassing. I will have you arrested, right now." I stood near the door, my posture rigid, my hands resting easily at my sides. I did not yell. I did not hurl insults. I employed the interrogation techniques I utilized on foreign operatives: silence and targeted pressure. "You are defending a ghost, Patricia," I said. My voice was quiet, forcing her to lean in to hear the words. "You parade around this ballroom demanding sympathy for a son who is actively dismantling your legacy." She scoffed, crossing her arms to hide her shaking hands. "My son is a respected executive. You are a paranoid, discharged failure." I tilted my head, studying the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat. "You value your wealth above all else. You measure a person's worth by their financial portfolio. Tell me, Patricia, when was the last time you reviewed Trenton corporate ledgers? Have you asked him about his margin calls? Have you inquired why the Department of Defense auditors are scheduled to freeze his government contracts next Monday?" Patricia uncrossed her arms. Her eyes darted toward the door. The haughty arrogance fractured, revealing a profound, creeping doubt. "He is bankrupt," I stated, delivering the intelligence with surgical precision. "He leveraged your precious aviation firm on high-risk private trading. He is drowning in debt. The fake DNA test and the custody battle are nothing but a smokescreen. He is trying to steal Leo's independent trust fund before the federal indictments drop." "You are lying," she whispered. But her voice lacked conviction. She remembered his recent stress. She remembered the hushed phone calls he took, pacing in her garden. The seed of doubt took root, cracking the foundation of her reality. Check his offshore accounts, I advised calmly. Ask him about the Cayman Islands shell company registered to his young assistant. I suggest you retain a white-collar criminal defense attorney. The fallout will drag your name through the mud. I turned my back on her and walked out of the VIP lounge. The psychological strike was executed flawlessly. Patricia was neutralized by her own paranoia. As I re-entered the ballroom, I scanned the crowd. Standing near the bar, clutching a lowball glass, was Trenton. He saw me emerge from the private lounge. He saw the terrified, ashen face of his mother peering through the frosted glass. Sweat beaded along his hairline. He tugged frantically at his silk collar, suffocating in the climate-controlled room. The illusion of his control was shattering in real time. Trenton slammed his glass onto the bar. He grabbed the wrist of Ashley, his 26-year-old assistant, yanking her away from a conversation. He dragged her out of the main ballroom, pushing through a set of heavy service doors leading to a dimly lit maintenance corridor. He was panicked. A panicked target always communicates their next move. I bypassed the crowd, slipping out a side exit that mirrored the service hallway. I reached into the interior pocket of my uniform jacket and retrieved a compact, tactical listening device. It was a high-frequency directional microphone, standard issue for covert reconnaissance. I pressed my back against the cold cinder-block wall of the adjacent corridor, aiming the sensor toward the narrow gap under the service doors. I secured the wireless earpiece. The audio fed directly into my ear, amplifying their hushed, frantic voices. "What is she doing here?" Trenton hissed, his voice echoing in the empty maintenance hall. "She is supposed to be hiding. Did you see her talking to my mother? She knows about the audit. She knows about the margins." Ashley sounded breathless, her heels clicking nervously against the concrete floor. "Trenton, we need to wire the money now and leave. The custody hearing is Friday. If she shows up to court, the judge will ask questions." "She will not make it to court," Trenton replied. The dark, lethal shift in his tone sent a chill down my spine. The white-collar coward was crossing a threshold he could never return from. "What do you mean, Ashley?" asked, her voice trembling. "I mean the rock through the window did not scare her off," Trenton snapped. "We are out of time. I need you to log in to the Cayman Ledger right now. Wire $10,000 from the embezzled corporate funds to that mechanic down in Olathe. Tell him the job is a go for tonight." "Trenton, no," Ashley pleaded. "That is too far. We agreed to take the trust fund and run. You did not say anything about a hit." "If she testifies on Friday, we both go to federal prison for wire fraud," Trenton snarled, his desperation blinding his morality. "Transfer the funds. Tell the mechanic to handle her SUV while it is parked outside that cheap motel. Tell him to sever the lines. She drives the steep canyon road to get back to the highway. Make sure it looks like a tragic, fatal accident." The audio feed hissed as they rushed down the corridor toward the parking garage. I lowered the earpiece. The classical music from the ballroom felt like a surreal, distant echo. My breath plumed in the cold draft of the exit door. The stakes of this war just shifted upon an entirely new axis. My husband was no longer just a fraudster attempting to steal a child and drain a trust fund. He had just initiated a premeditated assassination plot. He ordered my execution to cover his financial treason. I stepped out into the freezing Kansas night. The stars were hidden behind a thick, impending storm front. Trenton wanted a fatal accident on the winding country roads. He wanted to silence the only witness to his collapsing empire. I walked toward my truck, my mind rapidly calculating the physics of momentum, hydraulic failure, and survival. He paid a mechanic to cut my brakes. I needed to ensure he paid for the sabotage with his freedom. The storm front predicted the night before broke over the Great Plains just before dawn. I spent the remaining hours of darkness awake, sitting in the cold shadows of the motel room, running diagnostics on my secure server. Trenton had authorized a hit. He dispatched a mechanic from a neighboring county to tamper with my vehicle while I slept. I did not confront the man in the parking lot. A tactical operative never interrupts an enemy when they are making a fatal error. I needed the physical evidence of the crime to materialize. Let them spring the trap. I would control the detonation. By 7 in the morning, the rain fell in blinding sheets. The Kansas sky mirrored the gray asphalt, a bleak expanse of heavy clouds. I packed my duffel bag, secured my tactical laptop, and walked out to my heavy SUV. I conducted a visual sweep of the undercarriage, noting the subtle disturbance in the wet gravel beneath the rear axle. The mechanic had been here. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out onto the highway. The route back toward the military installation required navigating a notoriously steep canyon descent. It was a 2-mile stretch of winding asphalt that fed directly into a busy, 4-lane commercial intersection. The grade was severe. The windshield wipers slapped a frantic rhythm against the glass. I maintained a steady speed, feeling the heavy chassis grip the slick road. Through the downpour, the red glow of the traffic light at the bottom of the hill materialized. A line of civilian cars was already stopped at the intersection, waiting for the cross-traffic to clear. I took my foot off the accelerator. I shifted my boot to the brake pedal and pressed down to initiate my deceleration. The pedal went straight to the floorboard. There was zero resistance. There was no hydraulic pressure, no familiar grinding of brake pads clamping against steel rotors. Just empty, terrifying space. My pulse spiked, a sharp shot of adrenaline flooding my nervous system. The heavy SUV was picking up momentum on the steep, rain-slicked decline. The line of stopped vehicles at the bottom of the hill rushed toward my windshield. If I rear-ended that line of traffic at 50 miles per hour, the crushing kinetic force would crumple the front of my truck, turning the engine block into a lethal projectile. The civilian mother inside me wanted to close her eyes and brace for the impact. The Air Force officer took command of the cockpit. Years of tactical convoy training in hostile combat zones instantly rewired my response. I had been trained on how to handle armored transports experiencing catastrophic mechanical failures on treacherous mountain passes. Panic is a luxury that gets people killed. Action is the only currency that matters. I gripped the steering wheel with my left hand and slammed my right hand onto the gear shifter. I forcefully downshifted the transmission into a lower gear. The engine roared in protest. The RPM gauge spiked as the mechanical resistance fought against the steep momentum of the hill. It scrubbed off 10 miles per hour, but it was not enough to stop the impending collision. I reached for the emergency brake lever. Pulling it all the way up would lock the rear wheels, sending the SUV into an uncontrollable spin on the wet asphalt and flipping the chassis. Instead, I engaged the lever incrementally, feathering the tension millimeter by millimeter to create drag without losing steering control. We were 200 yards from the intersection. I needed a physical barrier to absorb the remaining momentum. To my right was a steep drop-off. To my left was a reinforced steel guardrail separating the avenue from a pedestrian walkway. I braced my body against the seat and jerked the steering wheel sharply to the left. I angled the heavy vehicle so the driver's side quarter panel slammed directly into the steel barrier. The screech of tearing metal was deafening. Sparks showered my windshield as the rigid steel chewed through the side of my truck. I held the steering wheel steady, forcing the vehicle to grind against the barricade. The intense friction acted as a crude braking mechanism, absorbing the kinetic energy and slowing the vehicle. The car shuddered, groaned, and finally ground to a smoking halt just 50 feet short of the busy intersection. Silence descended over the interior of the cab, broken only by the sound of the rain hitting the cracked windshield. I unbuckled my seatbelt with steady hands. My breathing was shallow, but controlled. In a standard situation, the next step would be dialing emergency services. I reached for my phone, but I did not call the local Kansas police. Trenton was a prominent aviation executive with deep ties to local politicians and law enforcement benefactors. If a county sheriff arrived, Trenton expensive lawyers would spin the incident as poor vehicle maintenance or a tragic accident. The evidence would be lost in a civilian impound lot. I needed untouchable jurisdiction. I needed a federal perimeter. I dialed Captain Thorne direct line. Within 45 minutes, a heavy-duty tow truck bearing Department of Defense contractor plates arrived at the scene. They bypassed the local authorities, hooking my mangled SUV and hauling it directly to a secure government-cleared mechanic garage on the outskirts of the base. I stood in the brightly lit bay of the secure facility, the smell of grease and ozone filling the air. The lead mechanic, an older veteran with calloused hands, lowered the hydraulic lift. His expression was incredibly grim. He held a heavy metal flashlight in one hand and a clear plastic evidence bag in the other. He gestured for me to step under the chassis. He pointed the beam of light at the rubber brake lines connected to the master cylinder. They were not ruptured from wear and tear. They were sliced open. The cuts were perfectly clean, deliberate, and expertly executed to allow the hydraulic fluid to drain out slowly. The saboteur ensured the brakes would fail entirely only after I had been driving for a significant distance, guaranteeing maximum velocity on the steep grade. Then the mechanic held up the clear plastic evidence bag. Inside rested a small, black, rectangular device with a heavy magnetic backing. He found it attached to the interior of my rear wheel well. It was a commercial GPS tracker. Somebody wanted to know my exact geographic coordinates, and they wanted to ensure I never arrived at my destination. I stared at the severed lines in the tracking device. The cold reality settled deep into my bones. The hushed conversation I intercepted at the charity gala was not idle panic. Trenton and Ashley were actively hunting me. I did not wait for military investigators to file paperwork. I walked over to the metal workbench, pulled my tactical laptop from my bag, and booted the encrypted operating system. I took the evidence bag from the mechanic and read the serial number printed on the back of the GPS device. A commercial tracker requires a subscription service to transmit real-time location data. That meant there was a digital receipt. I ran the serial sequence through my secure shadow server, cross-referencing the purchase history with the financial ledgers Captain Thorne and I had extracted the night before. The search algorithm churned for less than 30 seconds before returning a flawless match. The tracking subscription was not purchased with untraceable cash. It was paid for using the corporate credit card tied directly to the Cayman Islands offshore shell company, the very same ledger managed by Ashley. Trenton thought his generational wealth and high society status shielded him from consequences. He believed he could operate like a cartel boss, ordering hits and washing the funds through offshore accounts. He failed to realize that deploying a tracking device and sabotaging a vehicle to silence a federal witness crosses a lethal legal threshold. This was no longer a messy divorce or a white-collar embezzlement scheme. He had crossed into the realm of domestic terrorism. By targeting an active-duty military officer using illicit corporate funds, he handed the federal government the ultimate jurisdiction to dismantle his entire existence. The physical proof was sitting right here, on a greasy workbench. I closed the laptop. The snare was fully armed. All that remained was guiding the target into the kill zone. My encrypted mobile device began to vibrate against the metal table. The harsh buzzing sound echoed in the quiet garage. I glanced down at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed Trenton name. It was 9 in the morning. He was sitting in his plush corner office, sipping expensive coffee, watching his phone. He was calling to gloat. He expected a paramedic or a state trooper to answer my phone from the chaotic wreckage of a fatal crash. He wanted to hear the confirmation that his problem was permanently erased. I picked up the phone, staring at the green accept button, ready to deliver the psychological strike that would end his reign. The phone vibrated against the grease-stained metal table. The caller identification glowed in the dim light of the secure military garage. Trenton Caldwell, my husband. The man who had just spent $10,000 of stolen corporate funds to sever my hydraulic lines. I stared at the screen, letting it ring twice. In the wild, a predator relies on the element of surprise. When they set a trap, they wait in the shadows for the snap of the jaws. Trenton was sitting in his corner office in downtown Wichita, sipping his artisanal espresso, waiting for the confirmation of a kill. He expected a stranger to answer, a paramedic bagging personal effects, a state trooper sifting through the wreckage of a crushed SUV. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply breathed, listening to the ambient background noise of his corporate suite. I heard the faint hum of central air conditioning and the distant click of a keyboard. Then I heard his breath catch. He was waiting for the sirens, Grace Trenton said. His voice wavered. Just a fraction of an octave, but to a trained intelligence officer, it was a glaring beacon of shock. He was staring at a ghost through a cellular connection. The sabotage failed, and his brain scrambled to pivot. The coward retreated instantly behind his mask of corporate arrogance, attempting to assert dominance to hide his terror. "You are late for work again," Trenton sneered. The mockery was thick, a desperate attempt to regain control. He was referencing the formal military complaint he filed, the frozen bank accounts, the tactical starvation he engineered. He believed he had stripped me of my uniform, my clearance, and my livelihood. He thought I was stranded in a cheap motel, terrified and broken. "I am not going," I replied. My tone was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the frantic weeping pitch he craved. Trenton let out a short, arrogant laugh. It sounded hollow, echoing in the cavernous space of his corner office. "You are fired, Grace. I took everything. Your money is gone, your house is gone, the judge is going to take Leo on Friday. You are a paranoid, discharged failure." He paused, his breathing growing shallow, the panic seeping back into his vocal cords. "Where are you?" I leaned against the metal workbench, tracing the jagged, severed edge of my hydraulic brake line sitting inside the plastic evidence bag. "At my new job." "You cannot work anywhere," Trenton screamed. The sophisticated executive facade shattered, exposing the frantic, cornered fraudster underneath. "You have nothing. Your accounts are locked, your clearance is under review, you cannot make a single move without me knowing." I smiled into the receiver. The cold, calculated curve of my lips matched the precision of the digital strike I had just executed. I already did. I did not need to be in the room with him to see the exact sequence of events unfolding on his end. I could picture his sprawling mahogany desk. I could picture the dual monitors displaying his precious trading terminals, the lifeline of his fraudulent aviation empire. Trenton Firm relied on lucrative manufacturing contracts with the Department of Defense. Those contracts required strict compliance, rigorous security audits, and flawless financial ledgers. As a cyber logistics officer, I possessed the authorization to flag critical security vulnerabilities within the military supply chain. I did not need a civilian lawyer to file a motion. I did not need a judge to grant a subpoena. I simply utilized my federal clearance to trigger an emergency security lockdown protocol. While he was busy coordinating a hitman and forging DNA tests, I had transmitted the digital receipts of his Cayman Island shell company directly to the Pentagon Oversight Committee. I flagged his corporate routing numbers for international embezzlement and domestic terrorism. Over the phone line, I heard the sudden, sharp chime of an urgent system notification. Then another. Then a cascading chorus of error alerts ringing out from his trading terminals. "What is happening?" Trenton muttered, the phone slipping slightly from his grasp. I heard the frantic clatter of his fingers smashing against his keyboard. I knew exactly what he was seeing. The vibrant green graphs and scrolling ticker tapes on his monitors were turning stark red, then snapping to black. The Department of Defense automated security grid was severing his firm connection to the federal supply chain. Every single government contract underwriting his aviation business was being unilaterally suspended pending a full federal investigation. The commercial banks, sensing the sudden termination of his primary revenue streams and the freezing of his collateral, immediately initiated automated margin calls. His corporate accounts were locking down in real time. The digital vault doors were slamming shut on his stolen wealth. He was watching his entire empire evaporate into a string of zero-balance error codes. My screen's Trenton gasped, his voice tight with rising hyperventilation. "Everything is frozen. The secure portals are locked. The access keys are denied." "You thought wealth was a shield," I said, my voice echoing the cold, sterile reality of his impending doom. "You thought you could buy a forged medical document. You thought you could bribe a mechanic to sever my brake lines. You evaluated this war using civilian metrics. You failed to understand that you declared war on a federal operative. You are financially paralyzed, Trenton. You do not have a single cent left to pay a defense attorney, let alone fund an escape to the Cayman Islands." "Grace, stop this right now," he pleaded. The arrogance evaporated. "Revert the system. Tell them it is a glitch. I can explain everything. We can fix this." "There is no glitch," I replied. "You evaluated my silence as weakness. You evaluated my discipline as surrender. You evaluated your own intelligence far too highly. Enjoy the audit." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red icon, severing the connection. I stood in the secure garage, the scent of motor oil and ozone grounding me in the physical reality of my survival. The psychological strike was complete. The target was blinded, disoriented, and stripped of his resources. The battlefield was primed for the final extraction. 10 miles away, in downtown Wichita, the aftermath of my digital execution consumed the top floor of the Caldwell Aviation Building. I could envision Trenton dropping his mobile device onto the carpet. His hands shook as he stared at the darkened monitors. The lifeblood of his generational wealth was severed. The status he worshipped, the power his mother utilized to terrorize her peers, it was all reduced to inaccessible data. He reached for his desk phone, desperate to call his banking liaisons, desperate to threaten a compliance officer into restoring his access. Before his fingers could even brush the receiver, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through his private suite. The sound reverberated against the frosted glass of his door. It was not the polite, hesitant tap of a junior assistant bringing coffee. It was the firm, unyielding strike of consequence. The front door swung open. The neon sign of the roadside diner flickered against the dark Kansas sky, casting a sickly red glow over the cracked asphalt parking lot. I sat in a booth near the back, facing the entrance. My military training dictated securing a vantage point, but tonight my physical posture told a different story. I wore an oversized drab trench coat that swallowed my frame. I left my hair unkempt and skipped makeup, allowing the exhaustion of the past 72 hours to show on my face. I needed to look like a woman hovering on the edge of a nervous breakdown. I needed to embody the fragile, unstable veteran Trenton described in his forged psychiatric evaluation. The bell above the glass door chimed. Trenton stepped into the diner, bringing a gust of freezing wind with him. He wore a dark designer suit, a stark contrast to the worn vinyl booths and linoleum floors. Beneath his polished exterior, I detected the subtle tremors of a cornered fugitive. His eyes darted toward the windows, checking for trailing vehicles. The Department of Defense auditors were currently dismantling his corporate servers back in Wichita. He was a man running out of time, desperate for the liquid capital locked inside my son and his independent trust fund. He spotted me and strode over, sliding into the booth opposite mine. He did not offer a greeting. He reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a thick stack of legal documents, dropping them onto the sticky table. "Sign them," Grace Trenton ordered. His tone carried a forced, arrogant edge, attempting to mask the sheer terror radiating from his pulse. "These are the voluntary relinquishment forms. You give up all physical and legal rights to Leo. You forfeit the ranch. You walk away today, and I will tell the military investigators that your erratic behavior was a temporary lapse in judgment. I will save your pension." I let my hands tremble visibly as I reached for the paperwork. I kept my gaze lowered, staring at the harsh legal jargon. I channeled every interrogation survival technique I learned during my intelligence training, projecting total submission while my mind coldly calculated his imminent destruction. He genuinely believed his leverage held weight. He thought the threat of a court-martial and the freeze on my assets had broken my spirit. "I do not care about the pension," I whispered, ensuring my voice wavered perfectly. "I just want this nightmare to end. I will sign your papers, Trenton. I will give you custody. I will give you the house, but I need one thing in return." He scoffed, leaning back against the cracked vinyl seat. "You are in no position to negotiate, Grace. The federal auditors are tearing my firm apart because of your paranoid meddling. You owe me this signature." I reached into the deep pocket of my coat. My fingers brushed against a single crisp sheet of paper I printed at the motel earlier that afternoon. I pulled it out and slid it across the table, resting it next to his relinquishment forms. "I need closure," I said, allowing a single tear to form and drop. "The military suspended my clearance. My career is ruined. If I am going to walk away from my child forever, I need to know the truth. I need you to verify that the psychiatric records and the DNA test you gave the judge are genuine. I need to know my mind is truly as broken as those papers claim." The document I presented was a standard, legally binding affidavit of authenticity. It required the signatory to swear under penalty of perjury that the attached medical evaluations and genetic results were obtained through legitimate channels and represented unedited factual evidence. The snare was laid bare. I was handing him a federal perjury trap disguised as a plea for emotional closure. In a civilian family court, forged documents submitted by an attorney can sometimes be dismissed as a clerical error or a paralegal mistake offering the defendant plausible deniability. However, by signing a personal affidavit of authenticity, Trenton would remove any legal shield. If he signed that paper, he formally adopted the forged Department of Defense seal and the counterfeit genetic data as his own creations. He would bind himself to a federal felony, carrying a mandatory prison sentence. Trenton stared at the affidavit. A flicker of caution crossed his face. He was a white-collar executive accustomed to navigating complex corporate compliance laws. He knew the inherent danger of signing a sworn statement outside the presence of his expensive legal counsel. He knew those records were fabricated. For a fraction of a second, the instinct of a seasoned fraudster flared in his eyes, warning him to walk away. But Trenton was severely leveraged. He was drowning in margin debt. The federal authorities were breathing down his neck, and his only escape route required a one-way ticket to the Cayman Islands. To purchase that ticket, he needed the $600,000 locked inside Leo and his trust fund. Standing between him and his financial salvation was my signature on those custody forms. His boundless greed and staggering narcissistic hubris eclipsed his caution. He looked at my slumped shoulders, evaluating me as a defeated, weak opponent who posed zero subsequent threat. "Just sign the stupid papers," Grace Trenton muttered, pulling a heavy gold pen from his breast pocket. He leaned over the table, brought his pen to the affidavit, and scrawled his signature across the bottom line. He dated it with precise, arrogant strokes. He pushed the signed confession back toward me, his lips curling into a smug, victorious sneer. "There," he said, "the records are authentic. You are exactly as unstable as the doctors documented. Now honor our deal. Sign the relinquishment." I picked up a cheap plastic pen provided by the diner waitress. I did not hesitate. I did not shake. I smoothly and decisively signed my name on his custody documents, granting him the illusion of everything he demanded. I stood up from the booth. I reached down and picked up the affidavit, carefully folding it and placing it securely into the inner pocket of my coat. I left his paperwork sitting on the table. "I will see you in court on Friday, Trenton," I said quietly. "You will not be in court on Friday," he countered triumphantly, gathering his documents. "You signed away your right to contest the hearing. You are a ghost to this family now." I did not respond. I simply turned and walked toward the exit. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the freezing Midwestern night. The frigid air hit my face sharp and bracing. The instant the diner doors clicked shut behind me, my entire physical demeanor transformed. The slumped shoulders vanished. The trembling ceased entirely. I pulled my spine straight, snapping into perfect military posture. My stride became measured, authoritative, and lethal. The shattered victim act evaporated into the Kansas wind, replaced by the relentless focus of a tactical operative. Trenton had just handed me a signed, dated confession to a federal crime. He had formally sworn under oath to the authenticity of a forged Department of Defense seal. He had locked himself inside an inescapable snare. The bait was taken. The trap was pulled tight. I walked to my rented vehicle, my mind already shifting to the final phase of the operation. The reconnaissance was over. The execution was imminent. Friday morning dawned clear and unforgiving. The imposing marble columns of the King County Family Court cast heavy, elongated shadows across the polished concrete steps. The courthouse stood as a monument to civic order, a stark contrast to the chaotic web of deceit my husband had spun. I arrived 45 minutes before the scheduled hearing, shedding the oversized trench coat from my immaculate Air Force service dress uniform. Every ribbon, every medal, every silver insignia was aligned to perfection. I walked through the security checkpoint, my expression an unreadable mask of tactical readiness. 30 minutes later, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb outside the courthouse. Trenton emerged, projecting the image of a conquering patriarch. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit tailored to emphasize his corporate stature. His expensive vintage aviation watch gleamed on his wrist, catching the morning sunlight. He adjusted his silk tie, a confident, predatory grin plastered across his face. He walked up the courthouse steps with a swaggering cadence, flanked by his aggressive civilian defense attorney. Trenton was entirely convinced he had outsmarted his wife, outmaneuvered the federal government, and secured his stolen fortune. He believed he was walking into a routine administrative rubber stamp. He had no concept of the devastating biological reckoning waiting for him inside those heavy oak doors. The imposing architecture of the King County Family Court was designed to intimidate. Towering marble columns supported a vaulted ceiling, casting long, austere shadows across the polished concrete floors. The environment reeked of civic authority and bureaucratic finality. I sat completely alone at the plaintiff table. There was no frantic civilian defense attorney hovering over my shoulder, no legal pads scattered across the mahogany surface. I required none of those standard shields. I wore my immaculate Air Force service dress uniform. The dark navy fabric was flawlessly pressed, the silver insignia gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. My posture mirrored the rigid discipline of my training. My spine perfectly straight, my hands folded resting on the desk. I was not a terrified mother awaiting judgment. I was a tactical operative, sitting inside a sniper hide, watching the designated kill zone, waiting patiently for the target to walk directly into the crosshairs. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber swung wide. Trenton strutted down the center aisle, ensuring every eye in the room tracked his grand entrance. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, sharply tailored to project an aura of untouchable corporate dominance. A crisp white shirt and a crimson silk tie completed the facade of the victorious patriarch. Protruding from his tailored cuff was a heavy vintage aviation watch. It was an excessively expensive timepiece, a rare collector item he had secretly purchased using the embezzled defense contractor funds he desperately tried to hide. He flashed the watch deliberately as he adjusted his jacket, wielding the stolen wealth as a physical symbol of his perceived supremacy. He truly believed he had outsmarted a federal intelligence officer. His hubris was blinding, erasing any residual caution he might have harbored. Following closely behind him was his mother, Patricia Caldwell. She treated this judicial proceeding like a red carpet premiere. She draped herself in an expensive cashmere shawl, her neck adorned with heavy pearls that caught the ambient light. She bypassed the defense table and took a prominent seat in the front row of the spectator gallery. She brought an audience. 3 of her closest high society associates flanked her, eager to witness the public destruction of the woman Patricia despised. The Caldwell matriarch leaned over the wooden pew, whispering loudly to her sycophants. Her voice carried easily across the quiet room, dripping with rehearsed venom. She bragged about finally rescuing her precious grandson from a deranged military wife, securing the pure Caldwell bloodline against my supposed infidelity. She reveled in her impending triumph, completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial and legal storm gathering directly above her head. Hovering near the back of the gallery was Ashley, the young assistant, and offshore ledger manager. She clutched a leather portfolio tightly against her chest, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Unlike Patricia, Ashley understood the precarious nature of their corporate fraud, but she remained confident that the custody settlement would unlock the trust fund and facilitate their escape. The court bailiff announced the arrival of the presiding magistrate. A stern, no-nonsense adjudicator took her seat at the elevated bench. She adjusted her reading glasses, opened the thick case file, and scanned the docket with brutal efficiency. The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. This was the arena where lives were dismantled, and the magistrate held the ultimate gavel. Trenton, expensive civilian defense attorney, immediately took the floor. He possessed the slick, aggressive demeanor of a man accustomed to bullying unrepresented spouses into submission. He paced in front of the bench, launching into a highly calculated character assassination. He painted a horrifying picture of my overseas deployment, claiming the military had broken my psychological foundation. He asserted that Trenton was a dedicated, exhausted father, desperate to protect his child from an erratic, unfaithful veteran. The lawyer spoke with absolute conviction, completely unaware that he was participating in a massive federal perjury snare. To finalize this tragic matter, Your Honor, the defense attorney proclaimed, his voice booming across the chamber, we submit the voluntary relinquishment of parental rights signed last night by the plaintiff. She recognizes her severe instability and has agreed to grant my client full legal and physical custody, along with administrative control over the minor child trust fund. The lawyer retrieved a thick stack of documents from his briefcase and handed them to the court clerk. He did not stop there. He wanted to ensure the court record reflected my total character destruction. Furthermore, the attorney continued, pointing a polished finger toward the clerk, we submit Exhibit A, the certified genetic results proving my client is not the biological father of this child, exposing the plaintiff's marital deceit. And finally, we submit a sworn affidavit of authenticity signed and dated by my client, verifying that these medical and psychiatric records are genuine and obtained through lawful channels. The clerk stamped the documents, officially entering them into the permanent judicial record. That stamp was the legal point of no return. The snare snapped shut. By allowing his lawyer to submit that signed affidavit, Trenton formally adopted the forged Department of Defense seal and the counterfeit DNA template as his own factual evidence under oath. He was now permanently tethered to a federal felony. The magistrate reviewed the paperwork, her brow furrowed as she examined the relinquishment forms, the genetic printout, and the sworn affidavit. She looked up from the bench, fixing her severe gaze directly on my isolated table. The ambient noise in the room vanished. The reporters in the gallery stopped shifting. Patricia leaned forward in her pew, gripping her pearls, anticipating my total collapse. Trenton leaned back in his leather chair, a smug, predatory smirk spreading across his face. "Captain Moretti," the magistrate asked, her tone demanding an immediate response. "Your signature is on the relinquishment form. The defense has submitted explosive genetic allegations and sworn medical documentation. Do you contest the validity of these exhibits? Are you challenging the biological conclusion presented today?" The absolute silence stretched heavy and expectant. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and smoothly rose from my chair. I did not tremble. I did not weep. I straightened the cuffs of my uniform, my movements precise and unhurried. I locked eyes with Trenton, watching his smug expression falter slightly at my unwavering composure. "Your Honor," I stated, my voice projecting, with the clear, unwavering authority of a tactical commander delivering a battlefield assessment. "I do not contest the biological conclusion presented in that genetic document. In fact, I entirely agree with the assertion that my husband is not the biological father of my son." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The wealthy socialites whispered frantically. Trenton's smirk broadened into a massive grin, believing I had just publicly confessed to adultery and surrendered the war. His defense attorney puffed out his chest, victorious. However, I continued raising my voice just enough to slice through the rising murmurs. "We strongly dispute the malicious method of conception my husband is attempting to portray." The confusion in the room was instantaneous. The magistrate narrowed her eyes, lowering the paperwork. Trenton's grin froze his brow, knitting together as he tried to process my statement. "My husband did not discover a cheating scandal," I declared, ensuring every syllable struck like a hammer against anvil. "My husband is utilizing this court to cover up a profound medical reality he desperately hid from his own family. Trenton Caldwell is not the biological father of that child, because Trenton Caldwell is entirely, irreversibly sterile." The courtroom was paralyzed. The smugness violently vanished from my husband's face, replaced by a pale, clammy sheen of pure terror. His jaw dropped, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He gripped the edges of the defense table so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a hidden landmine. In the gallery, Patricia Caldwell let out a sharp, audible gasp. The sound was strangled, a manifestation of pure horror. Her hands flew to her mouth. The flawless elite bloodline she obsessed over, the genetic legacy she weaponized against me, was a complete biological fiction. Her golden son was a genetic dead end, and he had humiliated her in front of her most prized social circle. The defense attorney stumbled backward, bumping into his own chair. He looked at his client in sheer panic, realizing the catastrophic implications of the evidence he had just submitted to a judge. I reached down to my leather briefcase resting on the floor. I snapped the brass latches open and extracted a thick, certified, blue-backed folder. The raised seal of the Genesis Fertility Clinic gleamed on the cover. I held the irrefutable evidence in my hand, preparing to deliver the biological reckoning that would obliterate their empire. The blue-backed folder felt heavy in my hand as I extended my arm toward the approaching bailiff. The court officer took the certified document and carried it up the short flight of stairs to the elevated bench. The magistrate adjusted her reading glasses, broke the clinic seal, and flipped open the file. The silence in the King County Family Court was thick, hanging in the air like a localized storm front. I watched the magistrate scan the first page. Her expression shifted rapidly from stern judicial authority to profound, unvarnished shock. She was reading the official medical records from Genesis Fertility. Page 2 contained the notarized consent forms. Trenton's signature sat clearly at the bottom of the parchment, legally authorizing the use of an anonymous sperm donor due to his own documented irreversible sterility. He had actively participated in the conception of our son, only to fabricate a cheating scandal years later. The magistrate looked up from the documents, her eyes locking onto the defense table. She glared at Trenton with a gaze so severe it could shatter stone. In the front row of the spectator gallery, Patricia Caldwell seemed to shrink inside her expensive cashmere shawl. The elite Kansas aviation matriarch, a woman who spent decades curating a flawless aristocratic image, was watching her entire genetic legacy disintegrate. She had weaponized her social status against me, bragging about the pure Caldwell bloodline. Now she faced the undeniable reality that her golden son was a biological dead end. The whispered gossip of her high society friends ceased, replaced by stares of pity and revulsion. Patricia clutched her chest, her breathing growing shallow as the humiliating truth washed over her. At the defense table, the expensive civilian attorney read the shifting atmosphere. He leaned over, catching a glimpse of the clinic logo on the paperwork resting before the judge. He possessed decades of legal experience, and his survival instincts kicked in instantly. He knew he had just submitted a forged DNA test and a sworn affidavit of authenticity to a sitting magistrate. His client had utilized his legal counsel to commit federal perjury. The lawyer stood up, physically sliding his leather chair away from the table. He took 3 deliberate steps backward, distancing himself from Trenton. He raised his hand slightly, signaling to the court that he disavowed the fraudulent evidence. He abandoned his client to save his own law license. Trenton sat frozen, his pristine corporate facade melting into sheer terror. He looked left, finding empty space where his lawyer had just been. He looked back at the gallery, seeking his mother. But Patricia refused to meet his eyes, too consumed by her own public degradation. I leaned forward, pulling the microphone closer to my lips. My voice echoed through the vast marble chamber, clear and unyielding. My husband did not file this custody petition out of paternal concern, I stated, ensuring the court reporter captured every single syllable. He engineered this entire biological charade to secure unilateral control over a minor child. His sole objective was to access my son's independent trust fund. He needed liquid capital to mask a catastrophic financial deficit within his aviation firm, a deficit caused by his own reckless private trading. The magistrate flipped to the next page of my submitted dossier. I had included the financial ledgers Captain Thorne and I extracted, but financial fraud was merely the beginning of his desperation, I continued. The pitch of my voice dropping to a lethal, chilling register. When my early return from overseas disrupted his timeline, he realized a simple divorce would trigger a forensic accounting audit. He needed me silenced. Permanently. Trenton shook his head rapidly. His eyes darted around the room, hunting for an exit. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "She is lying! She fabricated those clinic records! She is trying to ruin my business!" The magistrate slammed her gavel, the sharp wooden crack silencing his frantic denial. "You will speak only when spoken to, Mr. Caldwell," she warned, her tone dripping with judicial fury. I did not break eye contact with my husband. I reached into my uniform pocket and produced the clear plastic evidence bag provided by the military mechanic. I held it up for the entire courtroom to see. Inside rested the severed, jagged edge of a hydraulic brake line alongside the small commercial GPS tracker. Yesterday morning, I drove down a steep canyon highway. I testified the grim reality of the assassination plot settling over the spectators. My brakes failed entirely. An inspection at a secure Department of Defense facility confirmed the hydraulic lines were deliberately severed. The mechanic also recovered this tracking device attached to my wheel well. Trenton's chest heaved. He gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning white. He recognized the black plastic casing of the tracker. A simple serial number trace revealed the purchaser, I explained, projecting my voice toward the gallery where his assistant sat. The subscription for this tracking device was paid for using a corporate credit card linked to a Cayman Islands shell company. The exact same offshore account my husband uses to hide his embezzled government funds. He hired a mechanic to cut my brakes, hoping a fatal car crash would erase his crimes and yield a $5 million military life insurance payout. The magnitude of the conspiracy paralyzed the room. It was a flawless, irrefutable chain of evidence, transforming a routine family court hearing into a tribunal for domestic terrorism. Trenton broke. The crushing weight of the cornered predator shattered his remaining sanity. He scrambled out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger toward the back of the spectator gallery. "It was not me," Trenton screamed, his voice echoing with desperate, unvarnished cowardice. He turned on the only person left in his dwindling empire. He pointed directly at his 26-year-old assistant. "Ashley did it. She manages the offshore ledgers. She is the registered agent for the Cayman account. She forged the DNA test. She hired the mechanic without my knowledge. She was trying to steal the corporate funds for herself. I am innocent." He threw his loyal subordinate into the line of fire, hoping to sacrifice her to save his own skin. He expected her to cower, to weep, to crumble under the accusation. Ashley did not weep. She stood up from the wooden pew. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer, clutching her leather portfolio. She did not look like a panicked accomplice facing decades in a federal penitentiary. She looked remarkably calm, her expression mirroring the same tactical discipline I utilized during my deployments. She stepped into the center aisle, ignoring the horrified stares of the Kansas socialites surrounding her. "Your Honor," Ashley said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through Trenton's hysterical accusations. "My name is Ashley Vance. I am not merely an executive assistant at Caldwell Aviation." Trenton froze, his arm still extended, his pointing finger trembling. He stared at the young woman he had bossed around, belittled, and involved in his darkest crimes. He realized, in that split second, he knew nothing about her true identity. For the past 14 months, Ashley continued walking slowly toward the front of the courtroom. "I have been operating as an undercover corporate whistleblower. When I discovered the initial discrepancies in the defense manufacturing ledgers, I realized the CEO was siphoning millions in government contract money. I knew if I quit, he would simply destroy the evidence, so I volunteered to manage the offshore accounts. I got in deep. I became his most trusted confidant." Trenton's jaw dropped. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow phantom. "I did not manage those accounts to help him steal," Ashley declared, holding up her leather portfolio. "I managed them to preserve the data. Every wire transfer, every fraudulent margin call, every payment to the hitman who tampered with Captain Reddy's vehicle. I documented every single keystroke. I intentionally left a digital trail of breadcrumbs so undeniable that federal regulators could dismantle his entire operation in a single afternoon." The revelation struck the courtroom like a physical shockwave. The loyal mistress, the quiet assistant who poured his coffee and hid his money, was the very architect of his corporate demise. She had weaponized his arrogance against him, playing the role of the naive subordinate while meticulously building a federal prosecution packet. Trenton let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the defense table. His empire was not just crumbling, it was a meticulously rigged demolition, and the detonator had just been pressed. Ashley turned toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber. I forwarded the final decrypted ledgers to the Securities and Exchange Commission 48 hours ago, she announced, a grim satisfaction settling over her features. I believe they have arrived to collect their return on investment. Before the magistrate could strike her gavel, before Trenton could formulate another desperate lie, the heavy brass handles of the courtroom doors began to turn. The air pressure in the room shifted, signaling the arrival of a storm that no amount of Kansas wealth could ever stop. Ashley stood tall in the center aisle of the King County Family Court. She detailed the precise routing numbers funneling defense funds into the Cayman Islands Shell Corporation. She recited the exact dates, the specific dollar amounts, and the false logistical invoices used to camouflage the staggering theft. The courtroom listened in stunned silence. The spectators hung on her every syllable, absorbing the sheer scale of the deception. She explained how the chief executive officer authorized a $10,000 wire transfer to an unlicensed mechanic just 2 days prior. The memo line on the offshore ledger read as logistical consulting. It was the exact price tag for a sabotaged vehicle on a rain-slicked highway. The court reporter typed at a frantic pace, capturing the undeniable confession for the permanent record. Trenton Caldwell sat paralyzed at the defense table. The man who prided himself on controlling every variable had nurtured the instrument of his own destruction, paying a salary to the very woman dismantling his life. Magistrate Miller leaned over the elevated bench. Her face hardened into a mask of pure judicial wrath. She looked down at the forged affidavit resting on her mahogany desk. She glared at the man who dared to weaponize her courtroom for a targeted assassination plot. Mr. Caldwell, the judge announced, her voice echoing with sharp, uncompromising authority. You have insulted the integrity of this tribunal. You submitted fabricated evidence under oath. You orchestrated a lethal conspiracy disguised as a custody dispute, attempting to manipulate the law to execute your own wife. She picked up her wooden gavel, raising it high above the sounding block. I am holding you in immediate contempt of court, and I am ordering the bailiffs to place you in holding, pending a formal referral to the district attorney. The wooden gavel never struck the block. The heavy brass handles of the double oak doors at the back of the chamber turned with a loud mechanical clack. The doors thrust open with terrifying force, striking the wall stoppers and sending a reverberating boom through the marble hall. A tactical unit stormed the room. 6 United States federal marshals marched in tight formation, wearing dark tactical vests adorned with bold yellow lettering across their chests. Flanking them were 3 stern agents dressed in sharp gray suits, their lapel pins identifying them as senior investigators for the Securities and Exchange Commission. The emergency automated security lock I triggered on the military supply chain grid had functioned flawlessly. The Pentagon Oversight Committee cross-referenced my digital flag with the whistleblower ledgers Ashley provided, prompting an immediate, coordinated interagency raid. The local county bailiffs stepped forward to intercept the sudden intrusion, but the lead federal marshal flashed a golden badge, forcing the local officers to stand down and step aside. Federal jurisdiction superseded all state-level proceedings. The armed unit moved straight down the center aisle, their heavy boots striking the polished concrete in a synchronized, relentless rhythm. They ignored the gasping high society spectators who shrank back into their wooden pews. They bypassed the plaintiff table entirely. They converged on the defense table like wolves cornering wounded prey. Trenton scrambled backward, knocking his expensive leather chair to the floor. He raised his hands in a frantic, pathetic gesture of surrender. The lead marshal did not pause to negotiate. He grabbed Trenton by the lapels of his bespoke charcoal suit, spun him around, and slammed him chest first against the polished mahogany desk. The heavy wood groaned under the sudden impact. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent chamber. Trenton gasped for air. His cheek pressed flat against the table where his forged documents still lay scattered in disarray. Trenton Caldwell, the lead marshal, declared, his deep voice commanding total submission. "You are under arrest. You are facing federal indictments for espionage related to the forgery of a Department of Defense official seal. You are charged with interstate wire fraud and the staggering corporate embezzlement of military contractor funds. Furthermore, you are formally indicted for conspiracy to commit murder against an active-duty federal intelligence officer. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly recommend you exercise that right immediately." As the secondary marshals secured the steel restraints, one officer noticed the heavy silver gleam protruding from the suspect's sleeve, the vintage aviation watch, the rare, exorbitant timepiece purchased using stolen taxpayer money. The officer unclasped the metal band, stripping the watch from Trenton's wrist. He dropped the expensive collector item into a clear plastic evidence bag, sealing it shut with a swift motion. The physical symbol of his stolen wealth and arrogant supremacy was reduced to a catalogued exhibit of financial treason. Trenton whimpered as the cold plastic brushed his skin, realizing his time had quite literally run out. The marshals hauled him upright. His crisp suit was wrinkled, his crimson silk tie askew, his hair falling wildly over his sweaty forehead. He looked across the aisle at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a desperate, crushing realization. He had lost the manufacturing firm. He had lost the offshore trust fund. He had lost his freedom. Grace Trenton pleaded, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, agonizing sob. "Please, tell them to stop. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I am the father of your son. We can work this out. Please do not let them take me." I remained standing at the plaintiff table. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. My heart rate remained steady, anchored by years of military discipline. I looked at the broken, weeping fraudster who had tried to erase my existence. I locked my eyes onto his, delivering a stare devoid of any warmth, pity, or mercy. "You are fired," I whispered. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The smug, arrogant dismissal he hurled at me over the telephone just hours prior had returned to seal his doom. The poetic symmetry of the moment paralyzed him. He crumpled forward, sobbing incoherently as the marshals dragged him down the aisle toward the courthouse exit. In the front row of the spectator gallery, Patricia Caldwell witnessed the total annihilation of her universe. The elite matriarch who had spent decades curating an illusion of untouchable aristocratic power watched her golden son paraded away in chains. The pristine genetic legacy she weaponized against her perceived inferiors was exposed as a hollow criminal sham. The whispered judgment of her country club peers surrounded her, pressing inward like a closing vice. The sycophants who had eagerly attended the hearing to watch my downfall were now actively backing away from her, terrified of being associated with a federal indictment. The psychological weight of her impending ruin became too much for her fragile ego to bear. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless wheeze. Her hands clutched frantically at the heavy pearls around her neck, her manicured fingers trembling so severely that she tore the string. The white beads scattered across the wooden pew, bouncing onto the marble floor with a distinct, chaotic clattering sound. Her face turned a sickly shade of gray as her breathing grew rapid and shallow. She collapsed sideways, slipping from the bench and crumpling onto the cold courtroom floor. She fainted dead away, succumbing to a severe panic attack as the grim reality of her shattered empire claimed her consciousness. Her high society friends recoiled in horror, refusing to extend a helping hand to the fallen matriarch. Ashley stepped down from the gallery, nodding politely to the Securities and Exchange Commission investigators. They escorted the undercover whistleblower out through a secure side door, shielding her from the impending media circus brewing on the courthouse steps. The magistrate sat back in her elevated chair, exhaling a long, weary breath. She looked at the scattered, forged documents on her desk, then down at the unconscious woman receiving emergency aid from court medics. The arena of lies was thoroughly demolished. The path to asset liquidation and financial restoration was now wide open. The aftermath of a federal indictment does not unfold with explosive theatricality. It operates with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a surgical strike. The United States government moves slowly until it gathers momentum, and then it becomes an unstoppable bureaucratic juggernaut. Within 48 hours of the courtroom raid, Caldwell Aviation was systematically dismantled. The Department of Defense formally severed all manufacturing contracts, initiating a sweeping audit of the compromised supply chains. Securities and Exchange Commission investigators descended upon the downtown Wichita headquarters like locusts. They padlocked the heavy glass doors, seized the corporate servers, and froze every single domestic and offshore banking account tied to the company ledger. The federal investigators did not just freeze accounts. They combed through decades of corporate filings, identifying every fraudulent shell company Trenton had established. The sheer volume of evidence was staggering, painting a picture of a man who believed the laws of economics did not apply to his bloodline. The sprawling aviation enterprise built over generations and sustained by an illusion of untouchable prestige evaporated into a labyrinth of federal evidence tags and liquidation mandates. Trenton thought his complex offshore routing offered a shield of anonymity. He failed to comprehend that white-collar crime always leaves a digital footprint, and the federal government possesses infinite resources to follow the trail. The financial eradication extended far beyond the corporate sector. The federal authorities targeted the personal assets purchased with stolen taxpayer funds, triggering a catastrophic collapse of the Caldwell estate. This brought the hammer of justice directly down upon Patricia Caldwell. The elite matriarch, who had spent decades curating a toxic hierarchy based on wealth and genetic purity, was violently expelled from her own kingdom. Federal marshals arrived at her sprawling Wichita mansion on a brisk Tuesday morning. They carried eviction notices and asset seizure warrants authorized by a federal magistrate. Patricia was given exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises. The high society queen was stripped of her designer furniture, her curated art collections, and her extensive jewelry vault. All of it was cataloged for auction to pay restitution to the defrauded military contractors. She walked out the front doors of her seized estate, carrying a single, battered canvas suitcase. She was forced to relocate to a tiny, government-subsidized apartment building located on the industrial outskirts of the city. The environment was a stark, unforgiving contrast to the manicured lawns and gated driveways she once commanded. The thin walls of her new residence vibrated with the constant roar of passing freight trains and commercial transport trucks. But the most devastating element of her new reality was the odor. The cramped apartment permanently reeked of harsh industrial cleaning chemicals. It smelled exactly like cheap motel soap. The poetic symmetry of her environment served as a daily, suffocating reminder of the vicious insult she had hurled at me in the foyer of my home. Patricia attempted to leverage her social connections, desperately calling her country club peers for loans or temporary housing. Every single phone call went directly to voicemail. She even tried to attend a Sunday service at her exclusive congregation, only to be politely but firmly escorted off the premises by the private security staff she once helped hire. The stinging rejection solidified her total excommunication from polite society. The elite aviation circle she once ruled treated her as a highly contagious pariah, severing all ties to avoid being dragged into the federal spotlight. She was left entirely alone, isolated in a fragrant prison of her own making, crushed by the realization that her status was nothing more than an illusion funded by theft. While the federal regulators extracted their pound of flesh, I initiated my own tactical financial recovery. I did not rely on the slow gears of the criminal justice system to secure my future. I retained a ruthless civil litigation team to file a monumental damages lawsuit against the remnants of the Caldwell estate. We targeted the remaining personal capital that had not been seized by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I sued for extreme emotional distress, fraud, and the targeted sabotage of my military career. Because Trenton was sitting in a federal holding cell without access to legal representation or liquid funds, he defaulted on the civil proceedings. The county judge awarded me the maximum requested damages, effectively transferring the last surviving fragments of their generational wealth directly into my control. I did not utilize the capital to purchase flashy luxury vehicles or integrate myself into the superficial high society circles of the city. I operated with the strict practical discipline of a cyber logistics officer securing a forward operating base. I hired independent financial fiduciaries to establish a series of ironclad, impenetrable trust funds for Leo. The structures were designed with rigorous legal perimeters, ensuring my son would possess total financial independence upon reaching adulthood. His future was shielded from market volatility and entirely insulated from the toxic legacy of his paternal lineage. I transformed the stolen leverage of my enemies into an unbreakable armor for my child. The fallout of the shadow audit also yielded proper recognition for the allies who stood in the trenches. Captain Elias Thorne, the military JAG officer who bypassed jurisdictional red tape to initiate the investigation, submitted his comprehensive dossier to the Pentagon Oversight Committee. His meticulous documentation of the defense supply chain vulnerabilities caught the attention of high-ranking commanding officers. The military does not ignore exceptional tactical initiative. Captain Thorne received a formal commendation and a significant promotion within the Judge Advocate General Corps. He proved that genuine loyalty and honor are not derived from aristocratic bloodlines or country club memberships. True loyalty is forged in the crucible of adversity, standing shoulder to shoulder when the incoming fire is heaviest. With my financial perimeter secured and my military career fully restored, I turned my attention to establishing a permanent sanctuary. I desired an environment completely removed from the suffocating urban sprawl and the deceitful corporate culture of Wichita. I purchased a beautiful, sprawling ranch deep within the rolling Kansas grasslands. The property sat at the end of a long private gravel road, flanked by vast, whispering wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon. It was a geographic fortress, characterized by the friendly, hard-working spirit of the Midwest and a deep, grounding connection to the land. The ranch featured a sturdy timber frame house with wide wraparound porches, offering unobstructed views of the sunset. I could sit on the heavy wooden steps in the evening, listening to the wind rustle through the crops, knowing that no unauthorized vehicle could ever breach my driveway undetected. I installed a comprehensive military-grade security system across the perimeter, ensuring total optical and digital surveillance of my property. I built an impenetrable fortress of peace, funded entirely by the staggering hubris of the people who tried to destroy me. My daily routine settled into a steady, peaceful rhythm. I returned to my post at the Air Force Base, neutralizing digital threats, with renewed focus. Returning home each evening to the quiet serenity of the plains. The oppressive shadows of the Caldwell family faded into the background, replaced by the bright, limitless expanse of the Midwestern sky. Yet, an intelligence officer knows that an enemy cornered by the justice system often attempts one final desperate maneuver before the cell door permanently locks. Trenton was scheduled to face the federal sentencing tribunal in a matter of months. His civilian defense strategies had crumbled, his wealth was eradicated, and his accomplices had turned state evidence against him. He was staring down the barrel of a mandatory maximum security sentence. Stripped of his leverage and facing total annihilation, The psychological pressure inside his holding cell was reaching a critical threshold. I knew the silence would not last forever, and the final legal confrontation was rapidly approaching. 8 months passed since the chaotic collapse of the Caldwell Aviation empire inside the local county courthouse. The swift, grinding wheels of the federal justice system do not pause for social status or corporate prestige. The arena shifted from local civil disputes to a high-security federal district tribunal located in the heart of downtown Wichita. The environment inside the federal building possessed a stark, unforgiving gravity. There were no murmuring socialites whispering in the gallery. There were no flashy civilian defense attorneys attempting to bully the bench. The chamber featured austere mahogany-paneled walls, thick bulletproof glass, and armed government marshals stationed at every exit. This was a theater of absolute finality. I arrived early and took my seat in the front row of the spectator gallery. I wore my Air Force service dress uniform. Every silver button shined, every ribbon sat in perfect alignment, and my posture reflected the unyielding discipline of a military operative who had successfully defended her perimeter. I did not come to testify. The prosecution possessed mountains of irrefutable digital ledgers and recorded confessions. I attended the hearing to bear witness to the ultimate conclusion of a war I never started, but decisively finished. Before the main architect of the betrayal faced the magistrate, the court handled the accomplices. Ashley Vance, the junior assistant who attempted to play both sides of the corporate conspiracy, stood before the bench first. She had provided the critical offshore banking ledgers and turned state evidence, hoping her undercover whistleblower narrative would grant her total immunity. The federal prosecutors utilized her data, but the presiding judge refused to ignore her active participation in a plotted assassination. Financing a mechanic to sever the hydraulic brake lines of a moving vehicle carried a profound penalty, regardless of her subsequent cooperation. The magistrate delivered a strict 15-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. Ashley wept quietly as the marshals escorted her out of the room. Her ambitions of leveraging corporate fraud for personal gain evaporated into the grim reality of a long, isolated confinement. Following her departure, a heavy silence descended over the courtroom. The heavy steel side door adjacent to the jury box clicked open. The sound of clinking metal echoed against the hard floors. Trenton Caldwell shuffled into the chamber. The physical transformation of my former husband was staggering. The arrogant, fast-talking aviation executive who once strutted down courthouse aisles wearing bespoke suits and a rare vintage watch was entirely eradicated. Trenton wore a stiff neon-orange institutional jumpsuit that hung loosely over his thinning frame. Months spent inside a sterile county holding cell had drained the color from his skin, leaving him pale and gaunt. Heavy steel transport chains bound his wrists, looping down to secure his ankles. The restraints forced him to walk with a slow, pathetic, shuffling gait. His designer haircut had grown into a ragged, unkempt mess. The smug, predatory smirk that previously defined his persona was gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified expression of a cornered fugitive facing the end of his existence. He looked incredibly small, stripped of the unearned wealth and the toxic familial hierarchy that had insulated him from consequence his entire life. Trenton took his seat at the defense table. His public defender, a tired-looking man juggling dozens of cases, did not even attempt to offer words of comfort. The evidence was insurmountable. The defense strategy had shifted from fighting the charges to simply begging the court for a shred of leniency. The presiding federal judge, a stern veteran jurist with zero tolerance for white-collar corruption, opened the thick sentencing dossier. He peered over his reading glasses, fixing his gaze upon the trembling man in chains. "Trenton Caldwell," the judge began, his voice booming with a deep, resonant authority that commanded the entire chamber. "You stood at the helm of a lucrative defense manufacturing firm. You possessed advantages and resources most citizens can only dream of. Yet, driven by an insatiable sociopathic greed, you orchestrated a monumental financial fraud to mask your reckless private trading failures. You embezzled millions of dollars from government contracts, routing the stolen capital through offshore shell corporations to evade detection. Trenton bowed his head, staring blankly at his chained hands resting on the table. However, the judge continued, his tone growing sharper. Your financial crimes pale in comparison to your moral depravity. When your fraudulent empire began to fracture, you did not accept responsibility. You attempted to manipulate the judicial system, using forged Department of Defense medical records. You weaponized a fabricated genetic narrative to steal a minor child trust fund. And when those cowardly tactics failed, you conspired to orchestrate a fatal vehicle collision. You financed a targeted strike against a serving military intelligence officer, attempting to murder your own wife to collect a life insurance payout. The air in the courtroom felt incredibly dense. The recitation of the crime stripped away any lingering illusions about the man sitting at the defense table. He was not a misguided businessman. He was a calculated predator. Your actions demonstrate a profound lack of humanity and an extreme danger to society, the judge declared, closing the heavy folder. For the charges of espionage related to the forgery of a federal seal, interstate wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, I sentence you to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. This sentence will be served without the possibility of early parole. Trenton's knees buckled beneath the table. A sharp, ragged gasp escaped his throat. 25 years in a maximum security facility meant he would lose the best decades of his life confined to a concrete cell. He would be surrounded by hardened felons who cared nothing for his former corporate titles. The judge struck his wooden gavel. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, sealing the irreversible fate of the defendant. Court is adjourned. The federal marshals moved immediately. They grabbed Trenton by his upper arms, hauling him forcefully to his feet. The chains rattled loudly as they turned him toward the holding cell exit. He stumbled his legs, struggling to support his weight. As the officers marched him down the side aisle, Trenton dug the rubber soles of his prison-issued shoes into the carpet, halting his forward momentum. For one brief, desperate second, he turned his head and looked across the courtroom, locking his bloodshot, sunken eyes directly onto mine. He was hunting for a lifeline. He wanted to see a reaction. He needed to witness my anger, my sorrow, or even a gloating smile of triumph. He craved any emotional response that would validate his significance, seeking confirmation that he still held some space inside my mind. He wanted closure from the woman he tried to destroy. I offered him nothing. I remained seated, my posture rigid and flawless. I did not flinch. I did not glare. I looked back at him with the cold, detached observation of a tactical soldier surveying a neutralized threat on a battlefield. My expression projected pure, unfiltered apathy. I viewed him exactly as I would view a deleted digital file, an anomaly that had been identified, isolated, and permanently erased from the network. In that specific, agonizing heartbeat, the final lingering fog of his narcissistic delusion cleared. Trenton stared into my unreadable eyes and understood the devastating magnitude of his miscalculation. He realized that he once possessed a beautiful life, a secure future, and a family. By attempting to obliterate my existence, he exclusively engineered his own permanent annihilation. I did not ruin him. He handed me the tools, and he built his own cage. A fresh wave of tears spilled over his cheeks as the profound weight of his isolation crushed him. The marshals shoved him forward, breaking the eye contact and dragging him toward the exit. The heavy steel door swung open, and they hauled him through the threshold. The door slammed shut behind him with a resonant metallic boom, swallowing Trenton Caldwell into the dark, churning machinery of the federal penal system forever. The war was officially over. The enemy was vanquished. I stood up from the wooden pew, smoothed the dark navy fabric of my uniform jacket, and walked out of the courtroom. I navigated the long, quiet corridors of the federal building and pushed through the heavy glass exit doors. I stepped out onto the wide concrete steps and took a deep, grounding breath. The crisp Kansas air hit my face, carrying the faint, earthy scent of rain and endless plains. The sky above Wichita was a brilliant, limitless blue, entirely free of storm clouds. The oppressive, suffocating shadow of the Caldwell family had evaporated, leaving behind a pristine, open horizon. I walked down the steps toward my vehicle, ready to return to the sanctuary I had built, knowing the final chapter of this ordeal was waiting to unfold. The autumn wind swept across the Kansas plains, carrying the dry, earthy scent of harvest. Endless acres of golden wheat swayed in perfect unison, resembling a vast ocean of amber moving under a limitless blue sky. I sat on the wide wraparound porch of my timber-framed ranch house, a mug of black coffee resting warm in my hands. The heavy, polished boots and rigid collars of my military dress uniform were tucked away in a cedar closet. Today, I wore faded denim jeans and a soft knitted sweater. The rigid tension that had defined my spine for the past year had melted, replaced by a grounded, quiet ease. The chaotic, echoing marble halls of the federal courthouse belonged to a different lifetime. Out here, the only sounds were the rustling stalks of grain and the gentle chime of a wooden wind spinner hanging from the porch eaves. A few feet away, my son Leo sat on a quilted blanket, deeply engrossed in stacking brightly colored wooden blocks. He babbled softly to himself, his small hands working with determined precision to build a miniature tower. The sunlight caught the golden highlights in his hair, illuminating his round, joyful face. He knocked the blocks over, erupting into a cascade of pure, unfiltered giggles. I smiled, letting the sound wash over me. The joy radiating from my son served as the ultimate confirmation of my victory. I had constructed a fortress for him, an impenetrable perimeter built not of concrete walls, but of unyielding legal boundaries and secure financial trusts. No toxic influence could ever breach this sanctuary. The deceptive legacy of his paternal lineage was severed, replaced by the honest, hard-working spirit of the Midwestern soil beneath our feet. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over the long gravel driveway interrupted the morning stillness. A familiar white postal truck pulled up to the front gate. The local mail carrier, a friendly man with weathered skin and a warm smile, waved through the open window. I stood up, walked down the wooden steps, and met him at the mailbox. We exchanged a brief, pleasant conversation about the upcoming harvest and the shifting weather patterns. It was a simple, grounding interaction, a hallmark of the resilient, community-focused population that defined this region of the country. He handed me a neat stack of envelopes, tipped his hat, and drove back down the dusty road, leaving me alone in the tranquil silence of the prairie. I walked back toward the porch, casually flipping through the assortment of utility bills, hardware store catalogs, and military correspondence. Midway through the stack, my thumb brushed against a rough, thin piece of paper. The texture felt cheap, distinct from the crisp linen envelopes surrounding it. I pulled it out. The return address sat stamped in stark, faded black ink. The emblem belonged to the United States Bureau of Prisons. The sender line bore the name and identification number of inmate Caldwell. A year ago, seeing that name might have triggered a spike of adrenaline or a sudden tightening in my chest. A standard civilian might have dropped the envelope, overcome by a sudden wave of residual trauma. I felt nothing of the sort. My heart rate remained steady. My palms stayed dry. The tactical discipline honed during long overseas deployments and tested in the crucible of family court held my emotional perimeters secure. I held the envelope up to the sunlight, studying the jagged, uneven handwriting. It lacked the bold, sweeping strokes of the wealthy aviation executive who once commanded corner offices. The penmanship belonged to a hollow, defeated man, his physical deterioration evident in the shaky ink. I sat back down on the wooden steps, sliding my thumb under the adhesive flap to tear the envelope open. I unfolded a single sheet of lined institutional paper. The message spanned the entire page, written in tight, desperate paragraphs. I read the words with cold, detached observation, analyzing the text as if reviewing an outdated threat assessment report. Trenton began his letter with a rambling, pathetic plea for forgiveness. He described the suffocating isolation of his concrete cell, lamenting the endless hours spent staring at a steel door. He wrote that the harsh reality of maximum security confinement had forced him to realize the profound depth of his sins. He complained about his mother, noting that Patricia was struggling to survive in her subsidized industrial apartment, entirely abandoned by her former peers. He whined about the loss of his bespoke suits, his rare watches, and his offshore accounts. Prioritizing his material grief, just underneath his performative apologies, the narcissism remained deeply embedded in his psyche, shining through the ink despite his attempts to sound remorseful. The final paragraph revealed the true motive behind the correspondence. He pleaded with me to bring Leo to the federal penitentiary. He begged for one final visitation, asking for the chance to look into his son's eyes. He claimed he needed to explain himself, to somehow impart a memory of a father rather than the legacy of a convicted felon. He was clinging to a desperate delusion, hoping he still held some shred of emotional significance in our lives. He wanted me to grant him the grace of closure, seeking validation to soothe the agonizing reality of his long sentence. I lowered the letter, looking past the porch railing toward the vast expanse of the Great Plains. A tactical operative understands that an enemy left to wonder is an enemy who continues to scheme. Providing any response, even a rejection, would hand him a microscopic thread of hope. It would signal that he still possessed the power to elicit a reaction. I owed him no closure. I owed him no validation. He had orchestrated his own ruin, and his legacy within this family was permanently erased. The Caldwells built their fraudulent empire on the aviation manufacturing floors of Wichita, seeking to rule the skies through corporate greed. But standing on this land, feeling the earth beneath my boots, I knew the real power rested in the quiet, enduring strength of the Great Plains. I stood up and walked through the front door, stepping into the warm, sunlit kitchen. The scent of roasted coffee beans and fresh cedar filled the air. In the corner of my home office, a heavy-duty paper shredder sat plugged into the wall. I did not hesitate. I did not pause to reread his frantic apologies or his pathetic pleas. I fed the top edge of the lined paper into the mechanical slot. The machine hummed to life. The cheap institutional paper offered no resistance. The sharp steel blades caught the document, pulling it downward with a ruthless, efficient grinding noise. I watched the shaky handwriting disappear, sliced into hundreds of tiny, illegible ribbons. The motorized teeth consumed the pages, transforming his desperate manipulation into meaningless confetti. The paper fell into the dark plastic bin, mixing with discarded grocery receipts and junk mail. The threat was neutralized. The erasure was total. I turned away from the machine and walked back out onto the porch. The cool breeze brushed against my face, carrying the distant call of a circling hawk. The ordeal of the past year had imparted a profound, undeniable lesson. True strength does not come from avoiding betrayal. Predators will always exist, hiding behind tailored suits, forged documents, and toxic family hierarchies. True survival requires understanding the fundamental mechanics of their deception. Toxic individuals rely entirely on panic. They launch sudden ambushes, freeze assets, and manipulate institutions, expecting their targets to shatter under the weight of fear and confusion. By maintaining a tactical, unyielding calm, you strip them of their primary weapon. You force them to operate in the light, where their arrogance inevitably becomes the instrument of their own destruction. I stepped off the porch and walked over to the quilted blanket. Leo looked up, dropping a blue wooden block to reach for me with open arms. I scooped him up, settling his solid, comforting weight against my hip. He rested his head on my shoulder, letting out a soft, contented sigh. I wrapped my arms around him securely, feeling the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. I stood in the center of the yard, looking out over the rolling grasslands that stretched toward the endless horizon. The Kansas sun began to lower, painting the sky in vibrant shades of gold, orange, and deep violet. The sprawling natural perimeter of the ranch stood as an unbreachable barrier, a testament to resilience and quiet endurance. We had survived the darkest ambush. We had dismantled the enemy from the inside out. I pulled my son closer, inhaling the fresh, clean air of the prairie. The shadows of the past were gone, burned away by the harsh light of justice and the unyielding strength of a disciplined mind. The future belonged entirely to us. We were finally free. The autumn breeze sweeping across the Kansas prairie carries a distinct, unforgiving clarity. Out here where the golden wheat bends under an endless pale sky, shadows find no place to hide. The landscape demands transparency. Sitting on the porch of my timber-framed ranch, watching my son Leo stack brightly colored wooden blocks in the afternoon sun, I find myself contemplating the true architecture of parenthood. American culture frequently broadcasts a loud, persistent message. The traditional family structure is a sacred institution, an unbreakable cornerstone of societal stability. We are conditioned to revere the picture-perfect household, the smiling faces gathered around a holiday table. But what happens when that cornerstone is carved entirely from deceit? The ordeal I survived with Trenton and Patricia Caldwell imparted a harrowing lesson regarding the illusions we accept under the banner of kinship. Society idolizes the affluent, picturesque unit. The Caldwells possessed the sprawling estates, the aviation firm, the vintage timepieces, and the exclusive country club memberships. They presented a flawless facade of Midwestern prosperity. Beneath that polished veneer, however, festered a profound moral decay. Patricia raised a son who believed wealth could purchase reality itself, who thought a forged genetic document and a severed hydraulic brake line were logical solutions to his own cascading failures. Trenton was a product of an upbringing devoid of accountability, an environment where emotional awareness was swiftly replaced by unyielding narcissism. Parenting, I have come to realize, is not about providing a life insulated from hardship. It is the rigorous daily practice of teaching a child how to navigate inevitable adversity with unwavering integrity. When we discuss family responsibility, the conversation frequently centers on financial provision or securing a prestigious education. We rarely acknowledge the agonizing, vital duty of protecting a child's character from the poison of their own lineage. Trenton viewed Leo not as a developing human being, but as a financial instrument, a convenient key to an independent trust fund, a prop required to maintain his fragile societal illusion. To raise a child with authentic values, one must prioritize raw honesty above comforting fictions. Honesty is a sharp, unsparing instrument. It cuts away the convenient lies we tell ourselves to maintain the status quo. In my situation, it meant confronting the chilling reality that the man I married was a hollow predator. Fairness, another central pillar of the moral framework I intend to construct for Leo, dictates that actions carry inescapable consequences. The federal penitentiary where Trenton currently resides serves as the ultimate grim manifestation of that fairness. I will not shield my son from the harsh reality of his father's choices when the time comes for him to ask those difficult questions. Shielding children from the truth does not protect them. It merely leaves them unarmed in a world that requires immense tactical resilience. Cultivating emotional awareness is perhaps the most demanding task within a traditional family structure, especially one fractured by betrayal. It requires acknowledging vulnerability without allowing it to dictate your responses. Trenton's entire existence was defined by a frantic, fragile ego. He panicked when a sterile diagnosis threatened his self-image, choosing to fabricate a vicious cheating scandal rather than process his own inherent grief. I will teach Leo to look inward with clear, unflinching eyes. He will learn that genuine strength is not the absence of fear, but the quiet discipline required to master it. He will understand that a calm mind serves as the most formidable defense against a chaotic world. This realization brings me to a perspective that frequently unsettles polite company. The conventional wisdom of our culture dictates that blood is thicker than water. We are taught that a child intrinsically needs both biological parents, that every effort should be expended to preserve those ties, regardless of how frayed or toxic they become. I reject that premise with every fiber of my being. Sometimes the most profound act of parental love is an act of deliberate, calculated erasure. Society demands we forgive, urging us to keep the door slightly ajar for the sake of the children. But forcing a child to maintain a relationship with a manipulative, destructive entity under the guise of family is a dangerous dereliction of duty. I severed Trenton's parental rights not out of vindictiveness, but out of a fierce protective obligation. Shared genetics do not entitle anyone to a seat at your table. Integrity, accountability, and genuine devotion remain the only currencies that earn someone the right to be called kin. Amputating a diseased branch is the only viable method to ensure the roots survive. I chose to rewrite Leo's family tree, anchoring it deep in the honest soil of the Kansas plains rather than the deceitful shadowed corridors of Wichita's elite. Here, surrounded by rolling grasslands and the quiet dignity of a hard-working community, I am charting a different long-term course for my son. The Midwest ethic relies on a deep, unshakable connection to reality. You reap exactly what you sow, and you cannot negotiate with the changing of the seasons. I want Leo to grow up with dirt on his hands and unvarnished truth in his heart. He will learn that societal prestige is meaningless if it requires sacrificing your soul to maintain the illusion. He will value the steady, reliable hum of a tractor over the hollow, sycophantic applause of a charity gala. We navigate a world where deception frequently wears the comforting mask of affection. If my journey resonates with the quiet, unseen battles you fight within your own home, if you have ever had to stand alone to shield the ones you cherish from the very individuals who were supposed to protect them, you are not isolated in that struggle. Join our community and follow Samantha Told Stories. Share your experiences, find your strength in our shared narratives, and remember that the most beautiful, enduring fortresses are often built from the wreckage of shattered illusions. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the porch floorboards, I watch Leo carefully place one wooden block atop another. His tiny tower sways in the breeze, but it holds firm. I think about the letter from the federal prison, now reduced to illegible ribbons in the bottom of a plastic bin inside my office. I erased the threat. I secured the perimeter. I won the war. Yet as the wind picks up, rattling the wooden wind chimes with a sudden, unpredictable fervor, a quiet, unsettling question lingers in the twilight. We can lock the doors, shred the letters, and build formidable walls out of unyielding truth, but can we ever truly sever the invisible, lingering threads of the past? Or do they simply lay dormant beneath the soil, waiting patiently for the rain? We spend our lives teaching our children how to forge their armor, hoping they will never actually need to wear it. But perhaps the truest, most enduring tragedy of survival is the creeping realization that the armor, once forged in the fires of betrayal, can never truly be taken off.